let's talk about earnings. There's been loads of them this week. Some of them have been things like big tech. Microsoft and Apple have both done very well. Or at least their stocks have responded pretty well. So on the day, Microsoft stock was down by 4.5%. It got a little push afterwards. Apple's was mainly flat and it got a big push afterwards. Revenues for Microsoft came in slightly under what was expected, 51.87 billion versus 52.44. Revenues for Apple were slightly higher than expected, 83 billion versus 82.8. Both of them were up year over year. EPS at Microsoft was slightly lower than expected, 2.23 versus 2.29, which was a raise of 2% year over year. Apple had an earnings miss. Had an earnings beat at $1.20 versus $1.16. That's 8% lower than it was a year ago. Always interesting to look at these stocks. Neither of us owns either of these, Steve, Microsoft or Apple, and I'm not going to put words on you for the time being, but we were chatting beforehand, and I don't think either of us has any imminent plan to own either of them.
No, I still think... I've thought for quite a long time that Apple has been quite overpriced, but it does seem to just keep going up, and it's one of those stocks that I'm willing to just let that pass me by. Microsoft in the same vein. I think that's, again, for something of its size, is quite highly priced, but then it surprises you every year by just how it continues to grow. Both of these stocks we thought would have macroeconomic weaknesses attached to them, so they might be potentially misses from both of them, but Apple came out strong. Its guidance was just as strong, and they basically said that they don't see any reason why they won't continue to grow in the next quarter. Microsoft, their CFO, came out and was really positive about guidance too. I saw Burry had called it the last hurrah, but it's hard to say, isn't it? I think Amazon's guidance was great as well. So all of these big techs are doing what big techs did all the way through the pandemic, which is just continue.
Yeah, so your point about macroeconomic headwinds speaks to the reason that I'm interested in these stocks, even though I don't own them and don't plan to own them kind of imminently. We talked a few weeks ago, I think, about the banks being a kind of bellwether for the economy, specifically the US economy. It's always good to kind of have a look at some of the bigger things in any particular sector to give you a feel for what kind of things are moving markets or moving businesses, along there. Microsoft and Apple are two good ones to have a look at, both in terms of tech in general and in terms of, in Microsoft's case, business stuff, and in Apple's case, kind of consumer based stuff. Microsoft is, to your point, I think the company that I feel kind of the exception proves the rule a little bit. Microsoft is an old company, and it ought to behave like an old company. It ought to have a massive dividend, nearly no growth of any sort, and just be quietly winding itself down, being a nice cash distributing machine. And actually it's in growth mode still. It's reinvented itself. It's busy acquiring Activision Blizzard. Its Azure stuff is growing and growing and growing, and it's kind of managed to sort of have another lease of life. And generally speaking, this is a kind of Aswath Damodaran point. I'm not taking credit or blame for this. Probably credit, because it's a good point. This doesn't work well for companies when they try to do this. When old companies start trying to act like young companies, or the other way round, for what it's worth, it tends to be sort of bad news for them. If you have a company that's too young and hasn't set itself up, and it starts distributing out all of its cash, that story generally ends quite badly. If you have old companies that keep pursuing growth when growth opportunities are not really there at your kind of size and in your kind of sphere, that doesn't usually end very well. But Microsoft is kind of the one that defies that kind of trend. I guess it inspires everyone else and makes them think, well, maybe we can be young again like Microsoft, right?
You've got to remember that Microsoft had a period where it was looking like an old hat business back in the early 2000s. It had a point where its growth had slowed. I think Gates had lost interest and Ballmer had come in and done his thing. And then they got Satya Nadella in, and he just reignited growth at the company, and they've not looked back from that period, have they? I mean, the period under Satya Nadella has been an incredible run for the company, from a big company to just an absolutely massive company. I think is it still the biggest company by market cap, or has Apple taken that back?
I thought Apple had taken that back. It has changed hands a few times now, and I remember it being on one of your quizzes not well, actually quite a while ago now. Largest company on the Nasdaq. The correct answer was Apple, but I think it might still be Apple again now. I'm not sure about that though.
Yeah, so I mean that's key for Microsoft, is that it's kind of hard to think about them as an old hat business when for maybe the last 10 years they've been growing at such a rapid pace. All they're kind of doing now is supplementing growth by adding extra arms and legs onto the business. So Activision is one that they've added on, but you can also remember last year it was Nuance as well that they added on, which was 10 billion, and we learned last week of the company that they acquired, Xander, from AT&T.
Was it called Xander?
Xander, yes, Paul. So that's another company that they've added on, which is now that's marketing, there's health, communications, and there's further leaning into video games. They're all new tendrils for Microsoft to grow from. Apple, on the other hand, tends to buy companies when they're very, very small and grow them out and tends to nurture them. Who knows what's coming from them? There's hints of an Apple car. If an Apple car comes, you've seen the revenues that those kind of companies can do. That would add a hell of a lot of revenue to Apple. That reignites growth. I think we're talking about a company that's doing. Is that Apple do about 80 billion in revenue?
Yep.
So this it's not a small company. I mean, when we say they missed by $1 billion, and you think, wow, that sounds like a lot, but when you're doing 80 billion, missing by one that's not a massive miss, is it?
It's not a massive miss.
So yeah. Big companies, they could grow, they could not. I wouldn't put my money there, but I can see why other people do, I think.
Yeah, I would if the price were right. And I can't complain about people buying big companies, right, when I own shares in Alphabet and Meta and Amazon and so on. Size isn't, the real thing kind of stopping me there.